Joining me this week is a writer with the International Business Times and the editor of their Political Capital section, which explores the intersection of money and politics. He's also one of the few people in media who consistently calls out both sides. David Sirota, welcome to the Rubin Report.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, this is long overdue. I've been harassing you for a while, and let's talk about that intersection of money and politics, because that pretty much is what it's all about, right? Like, at the end of the day, everything comes back to that.
Everything comes back to money and politics. I mean, you can explain, I think you can explain much of the elections and not just the election outcomes, but what different stakeholders in the elections really want and what the candidates really represent by looking at the money. I mean, it's the oldest, most, kind of old-fashioned notion of journalism, follow the money, and there's plenty of money to be followed, and certainly in this race, and I would say, even beyond the presidential race, the congressional races, state races, gubernatorial races. I mean, there's just so much money being spent right now, and money is not spent in politics for altruistic reasons for the most part. I mean, you've got, for instance, $1 billion in this election cycle being spent on state and local races. That is not money. Typically, a lot of that money is not money being spent altruistically. That is money that is being spent more like an investment.
Yeah, so what is the actual connection between money and action? Because this is one of the things when Bernie and Hillary were going at each other, her defense kept being, well, you got to prove that, yes, I'm taking money from people, she's not denying it, but you got to prove that it's made me do anything. And I don't know that he ever quite made the connection. How do you, as someone that writes about this stuff, how do you actually figure out if someone said, oh, well, I took this money, how do you actually prove that the action was because of that?
Well, it's rare that you get a piece of evidence that explicitly proves a so-called quid pro quo. Politicians are pretty smart about that. There's for instance an SEC pay-to-play rule, which says in general that financial firms that are contracted to manage state pension funds, retiree money, they can't give money, or at least the goal of the rule is that they can't give campaign contributions to governors who have the power to make those investment decisions. And the reason I bring up that rule is because in the write-up of that rule, when the SEC created that rule, they essentially said in the preamble of the rule that there's no way, in many cases, to concretely prove a quid pro quo, but we know that money nonetheless influences policy, in that case, in investment decisions. And it influences it in all sorts of explicit and implicit ways. When you are, for instance, surrounded by the donor class at all times as a lawmaker, and your world is disproportionately a world of fundraising and getting big money from politically connected industries and executives, that's naturally going to skew your policy views, both, I think, through the process of osmosis, where these are the only people that you're hearing from, and also through a process of understanding what kinds of resources you need to run a campaign. So that's one way where money is influencing, in a very deep way, policy and the political debate, where there may not be the standard envelope stuffed with cash
Right.
in exchange for, with a note that says, I want you to vote this way, right? I mean, that's typically not how it works. And again, the SEC in their rule, they acknowledge that. And so I in some ways, I reject the Clinton campaign's argument, which was basically their argument was, though, if there's no evidence of a quid pro quo, everything's fine. I just simply reject that. I mean, first and foremost, things that may be legal, technically legal, are still newsworthy, important, and at times ethically questionable. So this idea that if something is legal, it's not even newsworthy, we shouldn't even be talking about it, I mean, that's completely ridiculous. I would also say that this notion of needing proof of a quid pro quo to prove corruption, I also think is in many cases nonsense. Mm-hmm. If we understand and are honest about how money in politics works, we understand that these industries, Wall Street, let's say, is not giving millions of dollars to political candidates out of the goodness of J.P. Morgan's heart. I mean, they're
Right.
giving money as an investment, and they expect a return on their investment. And we can go through examples, whether it's Donald Trump, whether it's Hillary Clinton, Republicans, Democrats. There are clear examples where money goes in from a particular industry and a policy position or a policy favor comes out. Now, I don't subscribe to the idea that that's not potentially problematic if there was no envelope of cash with the note that says that's exactly what I want. It's problematic, and I would argue it's typically not coincidental that the money went in and the policy came out, or the policy went out and then the money came in. Those are typically not coincidental things. I mean, it was Barney Frank who was, a top ally of Hillary Clinton. He said a couple years ago on NPR, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, this idea that money doesn't influence policy unless there's an explicit quid pro quo. We'd be the first people in human history, where money didn't influence decisions and didn't influence human behavior.
Right.
So this idea that the connection between actions and donations are all coincidences unless you have explicit quid pro quo, I think is kind of ridiculous.
Right. So is the best example of that sort of the Hillary situation with Wall Street? Because basically we know that, Goldman Sachs and these companies, they were paying her for speeches. She got a lot of money from Wall Street. And then once the speeches were exposed, she basically said in these speeches, well, you guys are the experts, so you guys should regulate themselves. So it wasn't that there was some sort of thing that she necessarily signed because of money she got, but it's just the general implication more than anything else, which had there not been money, why would she have said it?
Right. Well, I mean, I also think it's what perspective are you coming at issues from? If you're coming at issues from a Wall Street perspective, not even making a value judgment on that, if that's just your perspective, you're going to have a different set of views potentially than somebody who's coming from a labor perspective, a union perspective. And so I think that as it relates to Hillary Clinton and Wall Street money, I think that some of the Wall Street money she's gotten, as the Wall Street is concerned, likes stability. I mean, that's just a general kind of nonpartisan thing. It likes the status quo. It likes stability. Donald Trump represents instability, unpredictability. Hillary Clinton represents what is perceived to be predictability. Mm-hmm. So I think that's some of it. But I also think, she's somebody who has been very friendly with Wall Street throughout her career. I mean, there's instances where she's certainly helped Wall Street. And she talked about that policy-wise in her speeches to Wall Street. I think going above the specific policies and votes that she's cast, and the bank bailouts and the like that she supported, mm-hmm. I think there's also money engenders a perspective that and it goes back to this, arguably less explicit, but I would say in some cases more powerful form of influence, where if you're surrounded by Wall Street, if your campaigns rely on Wall Street funding, if Wall Street is your world, it will be a bigger part of your starting point perspective on issues when you get into a public office. And that, more than anything, can be the most powerful form of influence. Because here's the thing. If you're looking at a policy decision and you've already started at a perspective where you're ruling out X, Y, and Z, and you're ruling in only A, B, and C, the Wall Street A, B, and C, then Wall Street didn't even have to fight on X, Y, and Z, because they have changed the course of the conversation, the parameters of the conversation, the parameters of the policy debate with the key lawmakers who set the agenda.
How much of this do you sort of put the blame of our current state on Obama? Because even this week, I was seeing he's fundraising for Hillary at private events in California. We know these are $30,000 a plate dinners. I mean, he's at the end of his presidency. It was all about hope and change. If anything, to me, in the 8 years, although he obviously has done some good stuff, the system got more ingrained. Money got more ingrained in the system in these last 8 years, when really that could have been and maybe should have been his biggest legacy, that we really were going to change the system, but it only could have been done by money. So what does it say that a two-term outgoing president still right now is spending so much time raising money for the party?
Well, I mean, I'm sure that President Obama and his aides justify it as kind of ends justify the means, or as they might put it in a nicer way, they're not going to, quote, unilaterally disarm in helping the party when it comes to money in politics. And that
I think they've used that phrase, right? Haven't they used that phrase related to this?
It's a standard phrase, right?
Yeah.
I may not like the system, but I have to operate in it. Don't hate the player, hate the game, that kind of thing. But I think where that argument falls apart, especially on the Democratic side, is in Bernie Sanders' fundraising. And I don't think this has been talked about enough, which is to say that Bernie Sanders' fundraising juggernaut in the primary was seen as amazing, unexpected. But the deeper analysis, I think, is it kind of blows away the entire argument that you can't run a well-financed campaign without using the standard big money corporate fundraising tactics. Bernie Sanders didn't win not because he didn't raise enough money. Bernie Sanders didn't win for lots of other reasons, but it wasn't a resource question. And if it was a resource question, I mean, I've heard the argument that, well, he was only able to raise money sort of too late in the game. And he wasn't able to front load the money raising with big money. But I don't think anybody argues that the fundamental reason Bernie Sanders lost was because he didn't have enough resources. And so that blows away the idea that Democratic candidates or the right Democratic candidates or progressive Democratic candidates, it's impossible for them to run a well-financed campaign without using big money sources. Now, I will, there's an asterisk there, which is that, look, presidential politics tends to dominate all debate, the entire debate in a way I would argue that has not been the case even in the last, 10 years ago. It was dominant, but it wasn't as dominant. I feel like now, when Americans think of politics, they think the presidential race, and that is basically it. Everything else is a down ballot race. So I think it's difficult for potentially a candidate for Congress or even a state representative, state senate to raise serious money through small dollar sources because they simply don't have the platform that a presidential candidate has, and the presidential campaign kind of drowns out down ballot races. But I do think that there is an encouraging path there, which is to say that there can be at least more of a mix of small dollar and some big dollar donations. That the old fundraising model of simply get 10 people in a room to give you $25,000 or $50,000, and that's how politics is going to work. There is, I think, now an alternate path, and I want to add that I think that the reason that hasn't been talked about, the reason the Sanders example hasn't been more talked about in the context of that, is because it's threatening. It's threatening to the interests that control politics right now. If you're a U.S. senator right now and you've gotten elected using the old fundraising model, kind of big money corporate fundraising model, you're pretty happy with the situation.
Right.
You don't want a small dollar fundraising apparatus to occur because that may finance your primary challenger or your general election challenger. So there are vested political interests who don't want what happened in the Sanders campaign to be talked about, who don't want there to be that alternative pathway, because the people who are elected officials now are basically masters of the current existing universe. So they, in particular, have a vested interest in not changing that universe because they're the masters right now.
So all that being said, and I'm totally with you, how should Bernie feel right now? Because it seems to me that a lot of the progressives, especially the millennials, are simply not going to vote for Hillary. I think, they don't like the money stuff, the Wall Street stuff, all of that. And now Bernie, I think, sort of looks like a sellout because he's backing the number one ingrained political institution person in Hillary. He got the house on the lake in Vermont, and it's sort of like, in a way, it's almost like she kind of killed the movement, and we know that the DNC was working with her to do it, because then Debbie Wasserman Schultz had to step down, and of course, what did she do? She went to work for Hillary Clinton. So what do you make of the state of the Bernie revolution?
Well, I don't think we can judge it yet. I mean, I think I think right after the election and into the first few months is where the rubber is really going to hit the road in the sense of whether or not the revolution or political movement that he galvanized is really going to be serious.
But doesn't it kind of feel over already? I guess that's my point more than anything else. It sort of feels irrelevant. Like it was there, no doubt it was there, whether you liked it or not. But it feels irrelevant to me at this point, and I don't know why she would feel if she was president at this point. She got what she needed out of him already. He helped her get there, so why would she owe him anything?
Well, look, I don't think it's about owing. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Which I don't think the Clinton machine feels any sense of loyalty or owing to the movement that Sanders galvanized, and I think it's more a question of, are political leaders like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, going to use the independent platforms that they have to be confrontational with a White House that will be headed by somebody who has proven time and again she is not a steadfast ally of the progressive movement. I mean, she's taken progressive positions at certain points in her career, but this is not somebody who is what you might call a conviction politician. And I don't think it's controversial to say that. So the question is, will the political movement be confrontational and at times be willing to be adversarial with a Democratic Party's White House, with a Democrat in office who it's crystal clear is not a conviction politician? And I think the jury's out on that, I could argue it either way.
Yeah.
I mean, here's the thing: the progressive movement, the modern progressive movement, does not have a good track record of being willing to, in any kind of serious way, hold Democratic Party politicians' feet to the fire once those politicians are in office. Barack Obama is, I think, example number one. I mean, he comes into office making all sorts of promises. The anti-war movement basically, for all intents and purposes, the mass anti-war movement kind of faded away. The core criticism of Wall Street was kind of anesthetized by Obama. You saw some of it; it bubbled up at times, but there was not, there was not mass pressure on Obama when he took positions that were oppositional to the progressive movement. I think you've seen a little bit of that on TPP. So it's not all 100% like there's nothing, but so that's one way to argue. It's that this is nothing's going to happen after the election. It's going to be the same old. But I think the other way you can look at it, and I don't know which way it's going to go, is that Hillary Clinton will come in as the most unpopular first-term president in modern history. I think the polls show that. I mean, what is it? Half or three-quarters of her voters are going to be voters who are primarily motivated by voting against Donald Trump. So I think, you could argue that creates a dynamic that might actually be productive. That popular presidents, popular Democratic presidents who come into office get the benefit of the doubt to basically sell out to their corporate donors. And maybe it's a good thing if a Democratic president comes in disliked or held in suspicion by a large mass of voters. And that creates a tension where the progressive movement it feels like it can be adversarial and confrontational, and that the Clinton White House feels like it not that it wants to respond, not that it owes a response, but that it has to respond for all sorts of various political reasons in a situation where the new president isn't all that popular.
Yeah. I hope it's the latter, but I tend to think it's going to be the former, but we shall see. All right, so let's move over to the Republicans, because the Republican situation with money, especially related to presidential politics, is particularly weird at the moment. Now, as someone that I say every week on the show, I don't believe anything that Donald Trump says. Do we actually know how much money he's put in and what is really going on with the fundraising? I checked his site yesterday. I mean, they're obviously taking donations, and he is doing some fundraisers, but is any of that transparent?
I mean, it's really hard to know who Donald Trump thinks he owes, I guess, I mean, we know that he's gotten some hedge fund money and he's gotten, some developer money. Donald Trump is it's hard to analyze him through the prism of money and politics because he has been a kind of a media creation. I mean, I do think the other, we talked about Bernie Sanders, small dollar fundraising. Donald Trump is a different kind of resource juggernaut in the sense that he didn't really have to spend that much money because he was such a free media phenomenon. And he says he has his own money and he's spent some of his own money on that. But look, to me, Trump, I mean, he hasn't been successful, at least if you believe the polls, but he's been successful in sort of the larger sense. I mean, he's the Republican nominee. He'll probably get above 40% of the country voting for him. And I think arguably he could have done that by spending almost no money. Because he is so well known, so famous, so iconoclastic, and so I think moving forward, Trump opens up this possibility that we've all kind of kicked around in our mind, I think, of what I've heard somebody call the Q score president, right? Q score is I think it's Q, right? The Q score, which is like how famous are you? It's this sort of rating for celebrities and how famous are you, and they have this aggregate way of figuring that out. And it's kind of like Donald Trump ran on basically pure fame and name recognition and celebrity, and then mixed in some very controversial positions. But it opens up the possibility of what's next is you're gonna have like Tom Hanks run for president or Harrison Ford, or there's just people who are just purely famous. And it's not to take away from those actors, but people who are just purely famous who can just transition very quickly to becoming political figures. And we had that with Ronald Reagan, although I think that's misremembered. I mean, Ronald Reagan was kind of a B-movie actor. He was well known, but certainly not as famous, I don't think, as Donald Trump when Trump ran. But it opens
up. He was also
up
a governor before he was president.
Right. He was also a good point. Right. He also had political experience. But it's kind of amazing to think about that. Look, the next election, I mean, I throw it out there. Think about the most famous actor you can. I mean, if George Clooney decided to run for president of the United States in an open seat election, would you say that he didn't have a chance to become the Democratic nominee for president? I'd say he'd have a pretty decent shot. I mean,
he'd probably win.
All things being equal. So is that good or bad? It's hard to know because I think the argument I've heard the argument is that, well, it's not that great that you have to come up through this political machine and you become a House member, then a senator, then you have a president, and that has all sorts of corrupting problems also. But I think Trump, we've seen now the flip side of that, which is that if you have somebody who's running basically purely on controversial positions plus Q score, that's not all that great either, even if that person isn't tied to the political machine and to the moneyed establishment that runs politics. I mean, Donald Trump is part of the moneyed establishment generally, but he's not really tied to the political money machine.
Yeah. Is there a chance that some of us on the left are not giving Trump enough credit in that this is a guy who has made a lot of money for him, regardless of how much money he actually has and whatever's going on with bankruptcies and taxes and all that. This is a guy who's lived in a lot of money with, and has helped his family and built these companies and all of those things. And he is actually trying to change the system. Now, we could go back and forth on whether that would be good or not, but it seems to me that some of us on the left were being a little too dismissive of maybe he's trying to, like you're basically saying, he is sort of extricating ourselves from this corrupt system. Maybe it's not for good reasons and maybe just running on Q score is no good and all that, but that there might be something good here, sort of getting away from all the fringe parts about his personality and over-the-top statements and that kind of thing.
Well, look, I view it this way, that Donald Trump is a complete opportunist. That's what he is. He's opportunism, the personification of opportunism. By the way, I think Hillary Clinton is the personification of opportunism in a different way. I think they both have different formulas or see different opportunities, and Trump has seen and created opportunities for himself in ways that are pretty ugly, are pretty dangerous, are pretty really appealing to people's worst instincts. but I choose to look at it this way, that if you separate out Donald Trump from what he's done, which I think is important to do. If you look at Trump as a political phenomenon, even separating out all the really serious issues about bigotry and polarization and demonizing minorities, you separate all that out and you ask, what does Donald Trump represent as a political phenomenon beyond his specific the specific beliefs he happens to be espousing? And I think it is a dissatisfaction with politics as usual, a dissatisfaction with what we call the establishment of both parties. And I think that while Trump will likely flame out and not win the presidency, I think that he has awakened people's on both sides their recognition that the country is deeply, in a much more profound way than perhaps we ever thought, deeply disconnected from and dissatisfied with its political system, with frankly, its economic system. And I think that Trump may be the trailblazer in this sense, that he kind of blazes the trail, or he's use the football metaphor, he's the fullback who's going up ahead, the block for the halfback behind him who's carrying the ball. That you may have Trump flame out and Democrats cheer and celebrate that, and then 4 years later another Republican comes from behind Trump, where Trump has blazed a trail, where another Republican without all the baggage of Trump manages to galvanize some of the same thing that Trump has galvanized, and without the baggage of Trump, and becomes a very successful politician. I mean, I think the election that sticks with me when I think about this election, and every election is different. People love to make comparisons, but if you're going to make a comparison, I think 1964, when you had LBJ was not a super popular at that point president and inherited presidency. He was a Democratic machine politician connected to the establishment. He exuded kind of the establishment politics. Versus Barry Goldwater, who was perceived as this outsider who was saying a lot of outrageous things, and Johnson portrays Goldwater as essentially insane. Johnson wins this big election mandate. It seems like this big realignment election because it was one of the biggest landslides in history. And then 4 years later, there was Richard Nixon.
Right.
The Republicans won. Now, a lot of stuff happened in those 4 years, but the point is that Trump, I don't think he's trying to serve a longer-term ideological interest, but he may end up effectively serving a longer-term ideological or at least partisan interest for the Republicans, in the sense of making it easier and training the parts of the electorate to want and to reward people who are anti-establishment politicians on the right.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I don't even see that as something that would just be rewarding the Republicans, because if there was a real anti-establishment feeling, it could reward the Democrats too, to get some new grassroots people up there.
Well, you'd think so, although there's, the amazing thing, I think, right now, is that there is more anti-establishment fervor inside the Republican Party and generally on the right than there is inside the Democratic Party and on the left. I think that oddly, the American left is a much more, has become a much more corporatized, professionalized political machine, with all of the, tactical success of that, but a lot of the loss of a principled protest. And on the right, you have a transformation of a Republican Party that used to feel a lot more, professionalized and lockstep and top down, has become, in some ways, the home of protest and dissent. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying it's good dissent. I'm not saying it's motivated out of something that's honorable, or I'm making no value judgment. I'm just saying, as political phenomena go, the left has become very good at suppressing, I think, protest and dissent and being more of a political machine. And it's the right now that where that protest and foment and dissent exists. And that's really a flip from when you think about, when you think back to the 1960s and the 1970s and which parties were the parties or that harnessed dissent and which parties did and did not.
Yeah, and that so gets to why I talk about the left so much, because I want my side to be better. And I've seen the left now, look, Obama's going to leave office as the longest president ever serving, while we were at war, because it was every single day of his presidency. We have the left now nominating and likely will be the president, will be the biggest Wall Street money ever. We have the left now suddenly talking about war with Russia, or, they were all about loving WikiLeaks and Assange and Snowden. And now the information that we've gotten about that, because it's about Hillary, suddenly they don't like it anymore. Like, I've really seen something sort of terrible, I think, happen to the left in the last couple of years. And I guess that's because Obama's been in power and they felt, it's like, how's Hillary? In a weird way, it's like Hillary has to run against Obama, but at the same time has to keep propping him up.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, there's a lot of factors that are at play, I think. I mean, I think that certainly on the American left, party loyalty is a stronger force than it is right now on the right. You see that, I mean, one of the telltale signs is you look across, left-wing magazines, left-wing publications, and it's all anti-Trump, all pro-Hillary, all the time. I mean, there is almost no scrutiny of Clinton on any kind of policy matter whatsoever, any kind of principled cause. There's there's very little analysis of that.
Yeah. So Trump really was the greatest gift to the corporatists in a way, because then they could get the eyeballs off Hillary, right, and just go. But
well, it's what I say. Trump has been the glue that has held the American left together for the last year or so. But I mean, that's oversimplifying. I mean, I think, Republican Party extreme, now it's Trump, before it was Ted Cruz, and, they tried to do that with Paul Ryan, and that's a little more difficult only because of his kind of public image, but, position-wise. And I think that the left has really used the right or being anti-Republican as its glue. And it'll be interesting to see if that can, if what we're, loosely calling the American left can continue to have that glue be a cohesive force in a Clinton presidency. I've often wondered, what happens on November 9th when Clinton is elected president, and you can't just scream Trump, you can't just say the word Trump to just end conversations about issues like Wall Street regulation, war and peace, defense spending, surveillance, civil liberties. I mean, right now, and certainly for the last year or so, certainly after the primaries, I guess, you see a story reported about a legitimate issue, questions of money in politics, corruption, whatever it is, energy policy, about Clinton, and the conversation ender, whether it's online and social media or an interpersonal conversation, the conversation ender is, well, she's better than Trump. Or just simply Trump, just scream the name Trump, and the conversation is over.
Yeah.
What happens on November 9th when you can't just do that? I mean, my bet is that, the Democrats are already thinking about that, and then they'll say, Paul Ryan, or they'll say Ted Cruz.
Right.
Will it be as effective?
Those are not as scary.
In the first 2 years of a Clinton presidency, when there may even be a Democratic Senate, you'd like to believe that post-election there will be a more honest discourse and policy debate. And I say that, again, not making a value judgment on a Democrat or Republican or liberal or conservative, but I think it would be good for the country to have more of the policy debates actually be on the merits rather than being tribal battles between two competing parties.